Okay, I'm pretty impressed. So a few weeks ago, we posted our very first video on the new 2020 iPad Pro. And in that video, I said, don't buy it. Don't buy the 2020 iPad Pro because it's almost identical to the 2018 model, which you can now find for a very low price. Links in the description, by the way. And in that in-depth first impressions, I mentioned that I wanted to wait for the Magic Keyboard to be released before I could give you guys the actual full review of the 2020 iPad Pro. The keyboard is now out, as you can probably tell, and I've been using it for the past 2 weeks, and it has completely changed my perspective of the iPad entirely. So without any further ado, here is my full in-depth review of the iPad Pro. Not just the 2020 model, but the iPad Pro in general, and I'm even going to answer the big question: what's a computer? And can you actually use this, the iPad Pro, with a keyboard and the trackpad as a laptop replacement? So grab some snacks, sit back, relax, and let's find out. If you have an iPad Pro, or any iPad whatsoever that supports the Apple Pencil, you have to check out Paperlike, our sponsor, for this video. Paperlike is essentially a thin screen protector that you apply to the iPad. That simply makes the iPad's display feel more like real paper, as opposed to that slippery glass feel that you normally get when using the Apple Pencil. So, if you're an artist or anyone that uses an Apple Pencil, Paperlike is a must-have. It's pretty much a game changer. Oh, and whenever you buy one Paperlike, you actually get 2 of them. And on top of this, you also get 100% money-back guarantee in case you're not satisfied. Simply use the link below to check it out, and thanks again to Paperlike for being a sponsor of this video. Okay, so I personally always had a love and hate relationship with iPads. You see, my very first video on YouTube was on the original iPad's launch from back in 2010, 10 years ago. And this wasn't even on ZONEofTECH, this was on my original Mr. Daniel with a Y 2010 channel. Please sub so we can hit 1 million subs there as well. Thank you. But no, really, the iPad definitely caught my interest since launch, just because it was Apple's first iOS device that had a larger display than the 3.5-inch display that the iPhone and iPod Touch had since 2007. And that display was just gigantic. At 9.7 inches, it was almost the same size as a full A4 sheet of paper. But even back then, I remember watching the iPad unveil the event live and Steve Jobs presenting it, and even back then I was asking myself, why? Why do we have this device, which was, at the end of the day, just a bigger iPhone? And I couldn't answer that question myself. So when the iPad 2 came out, I got one. I used it for a bit, and yeah, I kinda got bored of it. I mean, yes, it did have a much bigger display compared to the iPhone, but there wasn't a single thing that I could do on the iPad that I couldn't already do on the iPhone. So I kinda stopped using it. Then the iPad 3 came out with that Retina display, and I got one, and I just fell in love with that display. But unfortunately, the iPad 3 had a very weak processor that couldn't handle that Retina display, so it was quite laggy and it didn't really age that well at all. So that's when I stopped using iPads. I didn't touch a single iPad until 2015 when I bought the iPad mini 4. I bought it because I wanted this very tiny tablet for traveling, and at that time I was also using an iPhone 6s, which had a small 4.7-inch display. But in 2016, when I upgraded to the iPhone 7 Plus for that dual camera module, I stopped using the iPad mini again, just because the iPhone already had a massive 5.5-inch display. Then, in 2017, when the iPad Pro 10.5-inch came out and introduced that ProMotion 120Hz display, I got it once again, alongside with all the accessories, the keyboard and the Apple Pencil, in the hopes of replacing my laptop and having an iPad on the go. Heck, I even got a seller model for that iPad and the 256GB of storage option. And when I went to see my family in Romania for Christmas, the iPad was actually my main computer. Well, kinda, I still had to take my MacBook Pro, but I pushed myself to try and do all the main tasks that I could from the iPad instead. I even did a few thumbnails exclusively from the iPad Pro back then. However, that experiment failed. The iPad could still not compete with my MacBook Pro in terms of functionality. Then the 2018 big redesign came out, I got one, same as before, got a keyboard and a pencil, and same thing again. It just couldn't replace my MacBook. But now things have completely changed. Well, why is that? Well, first of all, we started seeing some leaks that Apple was working on actual mouse support in iOS 14. Apple did add mouse support in iPadOS or iOS 13 for the iPad in 2019, but it was essentially just an accessibility setting. You had to manually enable this, and you only had this massive cursor that would just click, and it couldn't really do much. It only worked with a few very specific mice, mostly the ones sold by Apple. Right-click or gestures weren't really supported, so yeah, it wasn't great. So when I heard the news that Apple's working on genuine mouse support for iOS 14, I was genuinely excited for this. But you see, rather than Apple waiting until iOS 14, they actually launched full mouse support earlier in iOS 13.4, or iPadOS 13.4 in this case. So now you can connect pretty much any Bluetooth mouse out there. It doesn't have to be an Apple mouse, and from the moment you move your mouse, the cursor will actually appear, and when you stop moving it, it will disappear. And not only is the cursor much smaller than the one from last year, but it is also a dynamic cursor, meaning that it will be adjusted based on the icons present on the screen. So when you have text to select, it will automatically transform into a text selection tool. When you're going through some menu options, it will highlight those instead. It's really interesting, I have to say. Using this cursor on the iPad Pro and then switching back to the standard arrow cursor on the Mac, I don't know, it just felt like going back in time like 10 years ago. Yeah, really strange. Right-clicks now works perfectly. It shows you the 3D touch menu if you click on apps, or it brings up the long hold if you're in a text document, giving you options for highlighting, finding a word in the dictionary, and so on. So yeah, it really works just as it should, and just as you would expect it to. But probably the best part is that you can even customize the controls if you have a mouse with customizable buttons. So yeah, I'm very impressed as to how massive this update is on the iPad. Also, anyone can use a mouse with their iPad as long as your iPad runs iOS or iPadOS 13.4. So this means that if you have an iPad Air 2 from 2014 or anything newer, you can actually use a mouse, which is pretty awesome. Now, I haven't really found myself doing that, using a mouse with the iPad. I mean, yes, I do have the Bridge keyboard and a Logitech mouse, the MX Master, but I found myself that gestures with a mouse weren't great. I had to swipe up from the bottom to go home and then do a very similar gesture to open up the app drawer. It felt like it was getting there, but something was missing. And that something was the Magic Keyboard. So this is a new accessory that Apple has just launched for the iPad Pro. And you might be familiar with the Magic Keyboard name, as that's exactly the same name that Apple's using for their Bluetooth keyboards, as well as the name they've branded the MacBook Pro 16-inch and the MacBook Air 2020's keyboards with. This doesn't replace the Smart Keyboard Folio that Apple launched with the 2018 iPad Pro, even though, in my opinion, it really should. But instead, this exists as an even higher end option. As if, $180 or 180 pounds was not expensive enough. This new keyboard now costs $300 or 300 pounds in UK for the 11-inch model, or $350 for the 12.9-inch model, making this keyboard more expensive or exactly the same price in the UK as the entry-level 10.2-inch iPad. So should you get an iPad or should you get a keyboard for your much more expensive iPad? Okay, so if it's that expensive, it better be good. And it is. So when it comes to the actual typing experience, it's actually extremely similar to the new 16-inch MacBook Pro's keyboard, or the new MacBook Air 2020's keyboard. The keys have the same 1mm of travel, so they're just so much better to type on than on that butterfly keyboard that Apple used from 2015 to 2019. We get a perfect tactile feedback and around 90% of the exact same typing experience as on the new MacBooks. I'm saying 90% because the keys on the Magic Keyboard are a tiny bit more wobbly than on the MacBook Air. Not by a lot though. And on the 11-inch model, some of the keys are a bit smaller in order to fit inside that 11-inch footprint. But other than that, this is an outstanding keyboard. In fact, I scripted this entire video on the iPad Pro with the Magic Keyboard. And I've also been scripting almost all the videos for the past 2 weeks on the iPad Pro exclusively. How cool is that? And when I went back to my MacBook Pro 15-inch 2019, which still has that previous butterfly keyboard, I felt like I just couldn't type on that at all. Quite funny how a keyboard case has a much better keyboard experience than Apple's MacBooks have had for those during that 4-year period. Also, maybe that's just me, but when I type, I prefer having all the keys as close as possible to my fingers. Basically just like holding a controller, I can type much faster when I don't have to reach and locate the keys. The MacBook Pro 15-inch has this massive palm rest and this gigantic keyboard. The MacBook Air 13-inch has a smaller palm rest, and I find this device to be the perfect device for scripting, and the iPad Pro 11-inch with the Magic Keyboard is extremely close to that, so absolutely an outstanding typing experience. Like, really, the only thing that I don't like about this keyboard, aside from the fact that some of the keys are smaller, is that we don't get any function keys at all. No volume keys, no brightness controls, nothing. Meaning that if you want to change any of those, you have to go into the control center and do it from there, which is quite inconvenient. But hey, I do get why Apple has done this. There wasn't really enough room on the keyboard itself for an extra row of function keys. Also, this keyboard case itself has two hinges. It has the main hinge, which can go up to almost 90 degrees, and then the secondary hinge, which lets you adjust the angle of the iPad even further. And I actually do really like this design a lot. Not just because it brings the iPad closer to, your eyes, but it also raises the iPad itself above the keyboard, letting you reach all the keys without your fingers getting blocked by the iPad itself. This design makes the entire keyboard actually feel larger and longer than it actually is. And just to make this keyboard even better, the keys themselves are also backlit, just like on the MacBooks. They actually do get quite bright, but unfortunately, there is no way to adjust the brightness of the keys without going into the settings, then general, then keyboard, then hardware keyboard, and finally get the backlight toggle there. I really wish that Apple would just add a backlight control in the control center, or at least give us a combination of keys or shortcuts that we can use for that. Oh, and speaking of that, in this menu in the settings, you also have access to Modifier Keys, meaning that you can actually remap some of the keys into even having an escape key if that's what you want. Now, my only issue here is that we only have 5 keys that we can remap into. Personally, I would have loved to remap the top left key, for example, which I pretty much never even use, to the escape key. Moving on to the trackpad, this is absolutely outstanding. So it is made out of glass, just like on the MacBooks, and you can press anywhere for it to click, unlike most laptops where you can only click on the bottom bit. However, unlike on the MacBooks where we have a force touch trackpad, essentially the trackpad itself doesn't click, but it vibrates to give you the impression that you clicked it. The iPad Pro's trackpad is just a regular pressable piece of glass. And using it feels extremely similar to using a trackpad on a MacBook. Literally the exact same smooth feeling, and you even get the exact same gestures, mostly. So you swipe up with 3 fingers to go home, you swipe up and hold to bring up the multitasking menu, you take the cursor to the bottom of the display to bring up the dock, and then if you keep on bringing it further down, you also go back to the home screen. You then swipe left and right with 3 fingers to switch between your active apps, and it took me a while to figure out how to bring up the notification center. And it actually turns out that if you keep pushing the cursor to the top of the display, then the notification center activates. Definitely not that intuitive by any means. I would have expected to swipe down with 3 fingers, considering that a swipe up with 3 fingers takes you home. But anyways, overall, it does actually feel a lot like just using a Mac. But unfortunately, there is no manual for using these gestures. Even in the Magic Keyboard Quick Start Guide itself, there is no mention at all of these gestures. So you kind of have to discover these on your own, which is very odd. Apple does have a support page where they list these, but you have to manually Google that page. Now, here's a pro tip for you. If you hold Command in any app that you have open, it will actually show you a list of all the available keyboard commands. This is something that we don't have on macOS, and it's honestly one of my favorite features yet. I mean, really, my only complaint with the trackpad is that it's maybe a bit too small, especially if you're coming from a MacBook. This is, by the way, how it compares to the 12-inch MacBooks. It's much smaller than even that. This is how it compares versus the MacBook Air, and this is how it compares versus the MacBook Pro 15-inch. But I mean, other than that, it's just like using it on a MacBook. Okay, portability-wise, how portable is the iPad Pro with the actual keyboard? Well, unfortunately, the Magic Keyboard actually weighs more than the entire iPad Pro itself. Not only that, but the 11-inch iPad Pro with the Magic Keyboard weighs more than the 12-inch MacBook. And if you buy the 12.9-inch version combined with a 12.9-inch iPad, it would be even heavier than the new 13-inch MacBook Air. Now, there is a good reason for that weight. You see, the MacBook Air has its brains and components on the bottom, and the top is just the display. The iPad Pro, on the other hand, has all of its components on the top, which makes it top heavy. So Apple has intentionally made this keyboard heavier on the iPad in order to prevent it from tipping over. Like, really, the only other solution that I can see to this would have been to make a kickstand, similar to what Microsoft has done with the Surface Pro. However, I have used that laptop for a few months, and I just couldn't really use it on my lap at all. Like, it just wouldn't sit. The kickstand extended way too much, and it wasn't great. The iPad Pro, on the other hand, is actually fully usable on my lap. Now, I do have to hold it from the keyboard because otherwise it does have a tendency to tilt backwards and tip over, but for the most part, it's honestly fine. And I cannot stress enough how sturdy this keyboard case really is. Like, there's zero flex to it. It honestly feels like a tank, so it's really, really well built, even though it doesn't really look like it. Speaking of tanks, a quick message from our sponsor, World of... Oh, I'm just joking. But no, really, speaking of tanks, in terms of protection, the back of the iPad and the front, they are protected, but there is no protection on the sides. So it is definitely not the most protective case out there if you're looking for that. But as a plus, the magnets holding the iPad, those are extremely strong. Like, I can lift the case from the iPad and even the iPad from the case itself, and it can still hold it perfectly fine. Okay, so now that you got a pretty good idea of what this Magic Keyboard case can actually do, how does it differ from other keyboard cases? Well, aside from the new Logitech keyboard cases, which work with the iPad Air 3rd generation and the 10.2-inch iPad, the trackpad gestures only work on the Magic Keyboard, which is a pretty massive selling point. On top of this, the Magic Keyboard also connects via the smart connector on the iPad, meaning that it doesn't need to be charged at all, and you don't even have to pair it. And yes, in case you're wondering, it doesn't even have a battery at all. Yes, even the keyboard backlight is automatically adjusted by the iPad's Ambilight sensor. It's pretty genius, yeah, a really genius way in which it works. And it even has a USB Type-C port for charging on the bottom left, which you can use, like I said, to charge your iPad. It doesn't really work for anything else, leaving the iPad Pro's USB Type-C port on the right available to use for things such as a USB Type-C dock, a monitor, or anything really. But probably my favorite thing about this keyboard are, the magnets. Attaching and connecting the iPad is insanely easy. You just bring it closer to the keyboard and it automatically snaps into place. And when you're done with it, you can just grab it by the bottom and you can easily remove it. Like, I haven't seen a 2-in-1 device that was so straightforward and so easy to convert from tablet to laptop mode and vice versa. Yeah, absolutely love this so much. My only complaint with this keyboard, aside from the price, is the material from which it is made from. And that's because it is literally the same material as the Smart Keyboard Folio. It has the silicone body, which gets scuffed in just a few hours of use, and it ends up looking horrible. I really do hope that Apple switches to something else. For this price, I would suggest leather, to be honest. Metal would just make it too heavy, plastic would make it too cheap, so leather would probably be the best choice. Okay, so now I talked about how amazing this keyboard is and how much it changes the iPad, but the real question is, does it actually replace, or can it actually replace a MacBook? Well, for the first time ever since 2011, when I got the iPad 2, I actually managed to upload a full video straight from the iPad Pro. Not only that, but I added the description, the tags, the callouts at the end, everything straight from the iPad. Now, up until iPadOS, which launched in 2019, this was not possible at all, just because we didn't get the desktop UI on YouTube's Creator Studio. So after iPadOS, you could upload videos, but you still couldn't add things such as the end screen callouts, just because you didn't have a mouse and the touch selection didn't work properly. Well, now it does. It works just as well as on macOS, and I can finally use the iPad Pro, like I said, to fully upload and schedule all the content, just like I would from my Mac when I'm on the go. And that's huge. So browser support is pretty much identical to macOS now. However, unlike macOS, where we don't get any support for iOS apps, at least not without Catalyst, on the iPad, we have full access to the full library of millions of iOS apps, meaning that I can download and post our socials from our Google Team Drive directly onto Instagram from one single device, whereas before, I would need my iPhone and my Mac. I can also play games much better than I can on the Mac. Yes, Macs have never been great for gaming, but on the iPad Pro I can even play Fortnite in 120 frames per second without an actual controller, and many other games support a controller as well, So yeah, pretty much a portable gaming console at this point. So gaming-wise, the iPad is actually a much better choice than a Mac is. Now, if you're a photographer, you can take photos directly on the iPad, then edit those photos in Lightroom and Affinity Photo or Photoshop directly on the iPad with the Apple Pencil, something that you cannot do at all on a Mac. Speaking of a Mac, you can even use the iPad Pro as a secondary display for your Mac. There are just so many things that you can do with the iPad that you just cannot do with a Mac. You have Face ID versus Touch ID, which, by the way, Face ID works brilliantly. You have a significantly thinner and more portable design and form factor. You have an even better battery life. You get cellular built into the iPad itself. We now have on-screen widgets thanks to iPadOS, which we don't have on the Mac. And according to John Prosser, Apple is working on bringing Final Cut Pro 10, Logic Pro 10, as well as Xcode onto the iPad. And yes, performance-wise, the iPad Pro is very comparable to modern MacBooks, and when it comes to exporting a video, you'll be shocked to seeing the results. Not only that, but it supports touch, and you can just lift it from that keyboard case whenever you want and use it as a tablet whenever you want. It's so good. Oh, and using the iPad with a trackpad and the keyboard at 120 Hz compared to the 60 Hz on my MacBook Pro is just unbelievable. It feels like a MacBook that came out in 2024 or something. It feels so futuristic. Also, my MacBook Pro does occasionally drop frames when switching between windows and so on, whereas the iPad Pro does not. So while you can do pretty much most things that you can do on a laptop now, and even more in some cases on the iPad Pro, it's still not perfect yet. You see, apps actually do need to be updated to take full use of the trackpad. For example, in apps such as the Notes app, we do get a cursor for when selecting text, whereas in apps such as Word, so third-party apps, we just get the standard cursor all the time. So apps made by Apple, they know when the trackpad is being used and they detect it automatically as a cursor, while other apps which haven't been updated, they detect the cursor just like a regular finger. Not only that, but I found that in quite a few apps, the keyboard just randomly stopped working. Very strange. And I had to force close the apps and restart those. And all of those apps, by the way, all of them were third-party apps. So once they get updated, I'm expecting that this will not be an issue anymore. And once professional apps such as LumaFusion or even Photoshop start supporting the trackpad properly, this is when the line between the Mac and the iPad will get blurrier than it already is. And hey, even connecting the iPad Pro to a monitor is finally more usable now. We still get that same horrible 3:2 aspect ratio, so we don't really get the full screen experience on a 16:9 display, but at least now you can actually use it with an external keyboard and a mouse and look at that display rather than having to look at the iPad that was underneath it. So there we go. After 10 years, I can finally call the iPad a full laptop replacement at this point. Also, there hasn't been a time when the 12.9-inch model of the iPad Pro was worth it more than the 11-inch. Because of that larger keyboard. And looking at this iPad Pro and what it can do kind of makes my MacBook Pro look old and outdated. I really do think that the iPad Pro is indeed Apple's vision when it comes to the future of computing. Okay, now just to end this, you might have noticed that I haven't really talked about the actual 2020 iPad Pro. And that's because there's really not much to talk about. It's essentially an iPad Pro 2018 with an extra 2 GB of RAM and a new camera module on the back, which now has an ultra-wide angle module, as well as improved AR with that LiDAR sensor, which most of you almost never use. Oh, and the GPU has an extra core, but that's actually the same Apple A12X chip, just a better binned version of it and a different name, A12Z, but it's pretty much the same. So yeah, for most people, I would highly recommend just buying the 2018 iPad Pro, this one. Again, left some links in the description box down below with some really good deals. Now, there is another iPad rumored to come out in late 2020 or early 2021. This is rumored to come with a mini LED display, which will finally bring the iPad's contrast and black levels on par with the OLED iPhones, or at least extremely close to those. So yeah, don't buy the 2020 iPad Pro. If you want a new iPad Pro, just buy the 2018 model, or just wait until that big newer model with a mini LED display comes out. But yeah, there you go. Finally, a laptop. Thank you for watching. Feel free to subscribe notifications if you want to see more insanely in-depth videos like this one. Hopefully it wasn't tech reviews and all that good stuff. I'm Daniel, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Oh, join the Zone if you want to become a member and support the channel. So yeah, thank you for watching. I'm Daniel, and I'll see you guys in the next one. ZONEofTECH, signing out.